All right, we'll get started. It is Wednesday, April 15th, 2015. This is the regular monthly meeting of the Urbana I.D.O.T Traffic Stop Data Task Force. Can I have a roll call, please?
Patricia Avery, Andrew Charles, Shinjini Chattopadhyay, Nicole Anderson Cobb, Alejandra Coronel,
Here.
Eric Jacobson,
Here.
Will Kiles, Peter Resnick,
Here.
Chandra Somerville, and Paul Testa.
Here.
So we are short a quorum. So I suggest what we'll do is defer any of our formal actions for the time being. I'd like to get through as much as we can and go ahead and do the formal actions if a couple more people show up. I would like to ask Todd to give his staff report up front because this is useful, important information, and we might as well mention it to everybody.
So on Monday night, we brought the request for extension before the Urbana City Council, before the Committee of the Whole of the Urbana City Council, and the Committee of the Whole has forwarded it on to be considered by the Urbana City Council. Typically when that happens, and Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong with this, typically when that happens, whatever request or ordinance or resolution that's coming forward will actually be passed. It's very rare for a resolution or an action to get to that stage and not go forward.
It was forwarded with a recommendation for approval.
With a recommendation for approval, and there were no objections that were voiced at the time, at least.
So that's, unless something emerges in the intermediate time that I think I can't foresee, that'll be very routine.
So that should give us our extra 2 months of work, which is ideal. So assuming that all goes as planned, and as Todd said, the vote was unanimous when they voted it out of committee, and it was, voted out with a recommendation for approval. According to Todd, his discussions with the mayor, there's no reason to believe this won't be approved next week. So I'm glad that's moving forward.
I will say there was a comment that was made that it just, and I can't remember the council person who made it, but basically saying it sounds like that very good work is being done here. I think that was obvious. It's obvious from the information that you all have already provided and the work that you've done up until this point.
So, yeah, I was quite pleased. So we'll look forward to that next week, and we'll continue our work. So why don't we start with old business? I think this should go relatively quickly. I see Andy is arriving now. But Paul, is there anything new on the statistical report?
Nothing for this meeting.
Good. I didn't expect so. I'm still getting through the 60 pages. Plenty of great information, and editing through it will be quite quite the challenge, but it's all good stuff, so thank you.
Yeah. Could I ask Paul a couple of things about,
Just to make sure that
I was drawing the correct inferences, and I apologize if this was covered last month. But one of the things that emerged in my reading of the report, if I'm getting it right, is that in contrast to most data around the nation, which shows that when African Americans are stopped and searched, the fraction of time that there is anything found is lower than when whites are stopped and their cars are searched. But in Urbana, if I was reading your graphs right, or your tables right, that's actually reversed. And that is that a fraction of times that contraband was found in the stops of black motorists was actually higher than when white motorists were stopped. Have I gotten a misconception on that, or is that actually what the numbers are showing?
So I guess there are two things going on. One is sort of all the contraband that is found, whites and blacks make up the plurality of stops involving contraband being found. In terms of the rates at which contraband is found per stops, they're all very, very low, and yeah, so the rates, they're all within, single-digit rates, and so
The differences are probably not significant.
yeah, so it
Okay.
would be hard to say. So, oh,
And I guess the other thing is that the racial disparity was pretty well correlated with geocode. As far as it'll pretty well correlated with geocodes with higher crime rates had higher racial disparity. Is that correct? With higher calls for service, I shouldn't say higher
So-
crime rates, higher,
Um,
that calls for service were correlated with racial disparity,
so calls for service are correlated with stops.
with stops.
In terms of the disparity, however, I think calls for service actually, I guess there are two things sort of. So the places with the highest calls for service don't necessarily have the highest disparities.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the places where we see persistent disparities tend to be places with relatively few stops in a given year.
I see, okay.
Um,
Okay.
And I take it the reason that that's the case is because if you've got a high number of stops in an area that's racially homogeneous in some way,
Yeah,
you're not going to see a disparity within that area.
right.
You're
okay.
only going to see it overall if you do it looking
Okay.
across areas. Did I get that right, Paul?
yeah, I guess the example I often think of is sort of with disparities is Meadowbrook Park, or that sort of geocode in the south that has a small housing development that is predominantly white with a few Asian people living there. And so it just takes a few minority stops that are maybe probably closer to the actual driving population there to produce a very large disparity in what the statistic would tell us we should expect based on the proportion living in one corner of that geocode. So the actual relationship between disparities and calls for service, I guess I'd have to drill down a little more. I know the correlation is strong with stops, total
and
number of
calls for
stops,
service, yeah.
but
I think one of the things that you'll find influencing that is if there's arterial roadways running through a specific geocode and that arterial roadway is a focus area and it's drawing people from all over the place, it's going to be more of a reflective of the community as a whole than that neighborhood.
yeah.
And
And it's just hard to know what the
Right. What that actually means, yeah.
But it does seem that there are neighborhoods in which minorities are less likely to live, but more likely to be stopped.
More
And
likely to be stopped.
So,
I did want to make a quick comment
Andy,
on
go ahead.
Your comment about the searches. One of the things that come up, and I don't think you were part of any of the conversations. Those search numbers that we looked at in the statistics, those also include things like inventories of cars when a driver's arrested for driving on a revoked license. Those aren't just consent searches or probable cause searches.
yeah.
And that inflates that number significantly, and it also deflates the number of what you would expect, the number of times when any kind of contraband is found, because they're simply, it's an inventory of the car after the person's arrested, they don't think that there's anything in there. It's a little less likely to find anything. But that influences those numbers significantly.
Any other questions for Paul since last time we met? I had one quick one. With regard to the racial profiling section and day versus night kinds of comparisons. One thing that you mentioned, which I haven't quite gotten my head around, is you said there's a disparity when you compare African Americans to everybody else, but not a disparity when you compare African Americans to whites or Hispanics. And I couldn't quite figure out how that was possible. Or maybe it's a statistical significance thing, and I will not mention the grades I got in my statistics classes in school. So can you drill down on that a bit?
So yeah, no, it was. I don't think the discussion was particularly clear in the report. So there were two ways we ran this analysis. One was just doing the whether light dark predicts the person stopped being a minority, and then whether light dark predicts the person stopped being an African American with only a sample that is African American or white. So in part because, well, it seems like based on those just overall I.D.O.T disparity ratios, that the disparity that exists is among African Americans. And then there are sort of the further complications are whether you think there are variations in the potential for this stops based on some observable characteristic of the driver to vary by the time of day. So whether you think 4:30 is different than 8:30 and you want that. And so that's why you have not just a single number but a range over a set of times.
So what was the thing that you found to have some statistical significance to it?
So looking just at overall, if you look at all minorities, the models are they fail to provide evidence that profiling is occurring or what the model suggests profiling should look like. And if you look at models with only African Americans and whites, there are some years in which we see a significant negative effect, which would be consistent with profiling, that when it's dark out, African Americans are less likely to be stopped, conditional on certain times of day. So between like 5:30 and 6:30. So those are harder to interpret. Like I don't know. I think when this type of analysis has been done in other settings, like in I think Todd circulated a paper from Minneapolis, that they did this to say, look, it doesn't matter how we specify the model, it's all the same. And in here, it sort of depends how we specify the model. And so part of it is just there are fewer observations than there are in Minneapolis to draw on, and so.
So conclusion-wise, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's something to look at here, but it's not clear what it is.
I'd say that the data are inconclusive. There is, in some instances, results consistent with racial profiling, and others not. And at that point, I don't have a good way of saying this model is exactly how we should think about the world, and this model is not.
Right.
Although I don't, I don't know. Is my best answer right now.
To me, it seemed like something worth noting in our report. It's useful information at some level, but it may or may not show anything very significant compared to the other kinds of information that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, if it makes it into the report, is something in an appendix, not in the main report, and it's something to note in a footnote maybe, but.
Good enough. All right. So, moving on, Police Procedure Public Engagement Committee. Nicole, obviously, folks saw the email message, was unable to make it tonight. I guess my main question for the other folks who are on the committee is Nicole the pen holder for the writing at this point? And we're going to talk in new business for a little bit about how we're going to go forward with the final report. Is she the person for me to get after? Because her schedule's been just insane lately.
I think it's important to talk to Nicole and kind of get together as a committee
Okay,
before we can meet with you.
right.
But we haven't got a chance to meet as a committee.
Okay, so if you all could, Nicole is now, I think tomorrow morning, leaving on travel for a few days. But as soon as you can, if you can, meet up as a committee and then get back to me with what the plan is. As I said, when we get to new business, we'll talk about doing the overall report edit and how that's going to work. But I just want to make sure that, we're continuing forward and we're getting work done. Anything else to report as far as your work goes?
No, other than the police department is training this month, and there's going to be specifically addressed in the training is going to be the new information gathered in the I.D.O.T. on the I.D.O.T. stickers, and that will go. That new information will start being collected May 1st.
Good enough?
So that's right around the corner.
Eric, please.
So I apologize because I neither attended the meeting last month nor did I do my homework of watching the video. But this new information will give some more details about the reasons for the stop.
Yes, just three things is all we're collecting, and that's is the stop for a traffic
Mm-hmm.
related issue, whether you're setting out to do that or it's something that you go on to patrol with the idea that every time I see this violation and I have the ability, I'm going to make the stop, or is it a hotspot policing type problem where you're addressing a specific other problem and traffic is part of the solution you're trying to employ towards that problem, or is it a community caretaking type of stop? And my original draft was to call it just an other and say I'm not sure why I made the stop, I just did. The chief of police, though, Chief Conley, said, no, we really don't, even though that would more easily encompass everything, we want to make it community caretaking, which may leave some stop, that would cut out any stop that was kind of a thoughtless stop, but we don't want those, so we're going to make it community caretaking, and that's more of the, I'm not doing anything in the moment, and I see that person doesn't have any taillights on their car, or there's a headlight out on their car, or things like that.
So what would be the classification? Let's suppose that there was a particular home where the occupants had reason to feel threatened. Let's say they had gotten threatening communications, but they didn't know from whom. And so you were sort of patrolling more around that home. And so you might stop somebody under circumstances where you otherwise wouldn't. Would that come under the hotspot policing, or would that come under community care?
I think that probably falls more into the hotspot policing. You're being directed there for a potential criminal problem, and realistically, it needs to, most of the time it's not going to be that vague. It'll be more specific and more realistic to what we're dealing with right now. We could say this house has been shot up twice in the last 2 weeks, and now I see a car that's been by there 3 times. We're on the verge of being able to make a Terry stop because of the suspicious activity that, we believe that criminal activity may be afoot, but we may not reach that level yet, but we see that the car didn't signal the turn when it made the turn, and now we're making the stop. The legal reason for the stop is they didn't signal the turn. What we really is motivating us is who's driving back and forth in front of this house that keeps getting shot up. And let's get some names and let's find out who this is. That's the hotspot policing, more specifically.
So do you call that, I guess you have Terry stop, which is, more probable cause. Just because of the name on the Supreme Court case, you could call the other kind of stop a Ren stop, but people don't do that, or? No. Okay.
And realistically, a lot of what ends up being hotspot or problem, other than traffic type stops for the police, a lot of those stops could fall outside of the scope of the I.D.O.T. study if the officer chose to articulate the reason for the stop as that Terry type of stop, that suspicious activity type of stop. And the officer may rise to the level that they could make a stop that way. But what happens is that as an officer gets experience, they end up going to court on, say, and I've used DUI a few times as an example because it's a little bit clearer sometimes. But an officer sees a car leaving a bar parking lot, or they watch somebody walk to the car and stumble and have a hard time getting the car door open, and they stop the car as it's leaving the parking lot. And they articulate all these observations that they made that led them up to the probable cause to make a stop. Now, this falls outside of the I.D.O.T. study now. We wouldn't record this as an I.D.O.T. stop. But then they get to court, and the assistant state's attorney that's prosecuting this says, you know, it would make my life easier and it would all be cleaner to explain if when this person didn't signal their turn, you stopped them for that. And it makes it an easier case. And it is more clear-cut. It's less hurdles to jump over. So the officer then learns, next time I'll just stop them for this minor traffic violation when I really want to look at some other things. And maybe I had enough reason to stop them for other reasons, but I'm going to take the way out that has been suggested to me. And it may be the officer's fault that they're looking for the path of least resistance, or it may be the state's attorney's fault that they're saying, no, let's make this cleaner and less hurdles for us to go over. But it ends up going that way sometimes.
So then that type of stop where would be coded by community caretaking, do you think, or?
I think that if what exactly was happening, if an officer was saying, you know what, I'm working beat 6-2, which is North Cunningham Avenue, and in the last 2 months, I've worked 3 bad accidents with people, and the common denominator is they're leaving the tin roof, and not to pick on any business, but bar X, bar Y, it could be any place, and between this hour and that hour. So I'm going to go to that location and watch it during that time, and I'm not going to give these folks a chance to run into another car. And I see somebody leaving, and I see a chance to stop this before it becomes an accident, and I do that. That's more of a targeted patrol, and I think that's probably walking the borderline between, is that a traffic problem or is that a hotspot policing problem, because it's an identified problem in your area. And it is traffic, so maybe we identify that, but we don't necessarily call that community caretaking. On the other hand, I think the community caretaking stops are more the something's right in front of me, and I think they might want to know about it, or it's a potential problem. I had a gentleman the other day that was driving in front of me, and it was a pickup truck, and the light above the cab, the red lens was broken out, so when he put on the brakes, it shined white back. Well, that's a violation of the Illinois Vehicle Code. It's not something that's a huge problem, but it's something that maybe he'd like to know about. And I actually, with him, I pulled up next to him and said, roll your window down. And I said, hey, this lens is broken out. Can you fix that? That's more community caretaking. It's right in front of me. It's something somebody might want to know about. It may help make things safer if we can fix it, but it's not something that normally is driving our calls.
And then just on the hotspot policing type category, is that something that, like, there's a directive when you go out to work on today that you're going to be in this area and the stops you make are going to be primarily hotspot policing? Or is it something that we know in general that when I'm here, you know, this is an issue, and so, you know, I might just be doing my job and I stop someone. I guess I'm trying to get the distinction between, like, how do we know if someone's going to report hotspot policing versus just chalk it up as a traffic stop and let it go?
Well, they have to report one of these things. And the job of the frontline supervision then becomes to look at this and say, is this passing the sniff test? There are things that we give officers when they go on the street and say, these are things to look for today. In an ideal world, you want each officer to know their beat to the extent that they can say, I know what's going on in this area I work, and I want to work on a specific problem that's occurring. That then becomes hotspot policing. Or it could be a traffic problem, in which case it's traffic. I think if as a frontline supervisor, if I saw an officer and half the tickets they were turning in were community caretaking, I would have to call that officer in and question them and say, look, you're just picking the low-hanging fruit here and not really helping solve any problems. If you don't know what the issues are in your area that you're patrolling better than this, then we need to sit down and review that. In any area that you patrol, and just say in this neighborhood here, you should have some ideas about what's going on here. You know, that we've had burglaries in this particular area during these particular hours. And I'm looking for somebody that's on foot, maybe between, or maybe they're burglaries where big things are being taken, so they're in a car, or maybe a truck. Or I know that from talking to somebody in the neighborhood that, hey, when school gets out between 3 and 3:45, there's cars that are speeding on Broadway. I know a specific problem in my area, or I've worked accidents that have called my attention to a specific address. So we do give officers some things, but I don't think we can't really say, well, here's the list of hot spots we've put out there, so it has to apply to this for it to be labeled hotspot policing. It's, if the officer says, I was looking at this particular problem, not a traffic problem, another problem, and made this stop as an effort to influence that, then it becomes a hotspot policing problem. And I think that'll give us some insight into, I think it'll be interesting to see how those numbers wash out between the different types of calls. And I think there will be a difference, I think.
So I would suggest when you all do your write-up for the committee, when you frame this particular bit, this was a little back and forth interaction that happened in the course of our work. This is not obviously a recommendation that we're passing through to City Council to pass through to the police department to instantiate. This is already underway. It was in part due to our desire for a few more interesting statistics, but I think it's good to point out that this was a recommendation that the department has already undertaken and sort of how we're going to evaluate it. So, obviously as officers get comfortable with which checkbox to check and what additional information and maybe how to describe those things, that'll be useful information to feed back in to do more statistical analysis and more, effects analysis. Eric?
So I would say there's another big reason why this is a good thing, and that is it increases the transparency of of what the police officer is doing, and I think that can only work towards improving the relationship between the police officers and the community.
Yeah, as a general rule, and I think it's especially important for your committee, but across the board, we do want to think about the recommendations we're making to City Council and make those clear. But thinking in terms of how this is going to improve the situation, what it's going to do, I think we want that all written up at the end of the day to explain why these things should be undertaken. So.
Could I ask just one more question? How many jurisdictions are traffic stops coded like this? Is this very unusual, or are other people doing it as well?
I think Urbana was already drawing more information than was required by the I.D.O.T. study. And I can't answer questions about who else is looking at the motivations. I think this is somewhat unique. I know there have been some different approaches to this IDOT study around the state, some on the very extreme end, like disciplining officers if your numbers don't add up to 1. So I think this is I think this is a more insightful way to go at it. And I think that the other thing that can't be overlooked in this is that it's a motivation to have the conversations. And for people to feel uncomfortable, and that's a good thing, that you have that moment where maybe you feel uncomfortable and you realize that we need to take a deeper look at some of the things we do and the ways we do them. So it's a good start into that.
Great. All right, so I look forward to hearing where you all are at. Community Impact Subcommittee, Patricia's not here tonight. Alejandra, anything new from you or Todd? I know you, there was some communication just before or after the last meeting with Patricia, and you don't have anything new. Alejandra, have you?
No, we haven't get together about that. The only thing that I have done during this time was that I did a ride-along, which I thought that I think we start moving forward in the relationship that we're trying to improve with the community. And as we know, a ride-along, you cannot predict what you're going to find in that. So I was thinking that by the end of my ride-along, I'm never going to have a traffic stop, and I say, well, this will dismiss the purpose of doing the ride-along. But lucky enough, there was a stop because there was one of the tail light was off. And, I mean, it was around 11 o'clock. I will tell you that I was alert and, trying to find and see and more cautious about how you can find. If you look in the car, you cannot look inside of the car. But this is me. And, I don't have any police training. I don't know what the police being trained about how they do traffic stop. But as a human being, that I'm a regular citizen and I don't have any training, I was looking more into the car to see what kind of infractions they can make. They could be a stop. And basically, it was obvious the light was off. It was late, and I didn't stop, and I didn't step out of the car after the officer did the first encounter with the person. But the good thing about it is that the officer came back to the car and told me what's going on. And the person explained that they have some issues about the light. And she's been checking the light, but something is wrong. And obviously, she didn't know what's going on. But the person didn't have the insurance handy. And so the officer told me, I told her to just go and check and see what's going, check and be calm and trying to find the insurance. So she said, Alejandra, you ready to come with me? Because hopefully, this is going to be just a warning because this person has not been stopped before. It was a female African American. And when we came back, the lady say, I'm sorry, but I don't have. I cannot find it. But the officer was very proactive and say, do you have a bank statement or you have a smartphone? If you have a smartphone and you have the possibility to check your bank statement and you have show that you pay your insurance, I don't have any problem. I will give you just a warning and just, try to make sure, because if you go to a different city or you continue driving and you have this issue. So I think that the officers already are in place, and I think the community, and in particular this person who was stressed out to thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get a ticket even though I have my insurance, but she struggled to find the proof of insurance. That the human aspect of the officer to be conscious and kind of help her out, because that was something obviously that it can be done. I think that we are actually seeing a different dynamic in all this study and people complaining about whatever previous issue was before. Our officers are making an action, and I have to say that was Officer Alfonso, and it was not very stressful after all for this person. I will tell you that she was not super happy, because nobody who got stopped are still happy about it, but it's a release not having a ticket. And it was very educative for me to kind of figure it out what we are here, and we are reading studies and opinions about how things go. Me in particular, I think that sometimes it can be very difficult to find. If at daytime, I mean, I haven't ride along and kind of focusing on that, but it is very important to see if you see the car, it is kind of complicated to find the person. You have to really go look around, check it out, and see where is the person, then turn around and then do a traffic stop. Otherwise, if you are in a distance, I think it's very, very hard to find the person, or to look into the person. After that, I was enough. I mean, I did that ride along, and then I asked Champaign Police to do another ride along. And it happened that I have also another traffic stop. And this was also a tail light. I will tell you that the officer passed around 2 or 3 cars that have the same issue, but they drive so fast. And it's crazy. I mean, it's something basic, but it's a traffic violation. And sometimes they let it go in a way, because if they got another call, they're not going to, don't go to the call that they have to go. But in this particular traffic stop, it was also the same thing. I mean, it was a rental car. The person was not familiar with how to turn the light on. And obviously, I mean, there was something that they tried to kind of show how, and then say, I told them my light were on because the front light was on, but the back light, they were not. And they still giving a warning to this person, because, I mean, it's a rental car. It's a person who just rent a car that particular day. And by the time that they rent the car and, and it turned dark, the officer have the discretion to say, I'm going to give you a warning. But go back to your rental car and ask and see how you're going to turn the light off. And that helped me in a way of thinking that I have a little bit more hope about how we can move into this study and provide a better way for our community to understand what the process is, and how people can have a better interaction with law enforcement.
Thank you. Any questions? I was wondering, your sense, given what Andy was talking about earlier, was your sense that these were what he was calling community caretaking stops, rather than the officer was stationed there for traffic purposes specifically, or was in a hot spot? These were just happened upon someone who had a taillight out in both cases?
I will take it in the Sun opinion. It was a caretaking.
Interesting.
Care community.
Right. Interesting. All right. If there's nothing else on that, then Social Science Subcommittee, Eric sent in his completed draft this time. I had mentioned to him before the meeting some of the discussion we had last time about the intro and the use of some of the technical terminology like probable cause versus suspicion. And Eric's already said he'll go through and make sure that he was using in words he intended. Did you want to make any comments about it, Eric, or did anyone have any questions about the report?
I'll just point out maybe a couple of things that
I think you're not on.
I'll just point out a couple of things that actually emerged in my mind as I was writing this that hadn't quite emerged before. And this is that just if one looks at the racial disparity, at the fact that the police forces are whiter than the population, that even if there were, and given the fact that that searches don't turn up, the great majority of searches don't turn anything up, just the numbers will guarantee that substantial numbers of African Americans will have been stopped and had their cars searched by white officers, and nothing will be found. And that will happen just because of the statistics, without necessarily there being any bias. So that had really struck me as you know, that struck me in a way that hadn't before. The other thing that struck me, I went back and looked at the national accident statistics, and it really does seem to be true that people of Asian descent drive more safely than any other ethnic groups in the country. We found a very small fraction of Asians who were stopped, you know, in proportion to their population, and that is reflected almost exactly at the same ratio in the number of traffic accidents across the country, if those are analyzed by the race or ethnicity of the driver. That's not the focus of our study, but it just, you know, struck me, so I thought I would mention it. And then the other thing that struck me is that, of course, the investigative stops that lead to arrests are embedded in a criminal justice system that results in lots of people winding up in jail because of substance abuse or mental illness. And I'm sure that's as true of the investigatory stops as any other sort of pathway to being arrested. And I'm very, very heartened by the recent evidence that the county is really going to take seriously the possibility of reforming our criminal justice system to do better in that respect. And so I did put in a comment on that and a couple of references, and I want to talk up, in fact, in particular, I didn't put in the exact date and time, but Leon Evans, who's the CEO of the Center for Healthcare Services in San Antonio, and who was major architect of their jail diversion program, where they actually have a team of police officers who are mental health officers, and they don't arrest people; they get them into mental health treatment under circumstances that are, that otherwise, in other communities would involve, would probably involve an arrest and winding up in the county jail. So I think that the county has become serious about considering this. And so I think that, I think that our, the recommendations that we make and the insights that come out of our study will, I think, fold into that whole issue in a way that I think, has a good chance to improve things. So I'm actually more optimistic about how the whole community is going in this area than I've ever been really before.
Any further questions about Eric's report? I think this leads into the one item of new business I would wanted to talk about, which is the editing of the overall report. And I think I mentioned this last meeting. I do want to get a sense of everyone to see if everyone's okay with this plan going forward. I had said that my intention was to hold the pen on editing together all of the pieces. The stuff that Eric was talking about, I can see immediately how it weaves into the statistics information, how it weaves into the police procedures information. My plan, if everybody is okay with it, is to, as I said, hold the pen, maybe recruit one or two others to be part of an editing team, where overall what we would do is sort of take the executive summaries of each of the portions and weave them together. And the main body of the report, for instance, Paul has a lot of wonderful statistical information for the main body of the report that I would think would be pulled in pretty directly. Obviously, for the weaving together and the figuring out how the things interact, certain information that Eric's been researching on the sort of national level has to be woven in with our local statistics and how those things go together. So I would anticipate I would meet up with the two of them and say, okay, how do these two fit and what kinds of things do we want to say about that? Come up with a proposal for the overall structure. And by next month, have, at least for the pieces that we've got together already, sort of an overall, here's the direction the edit's going, so you can have a pass at it, maybe do this iteratively, put out mid-month something that's a skeleton, have you, be able to look at that so that when you come to the meeting you'll have a little more. That way the public can start to also have a look at it if we put it out on the website as we go. But as I said, I imagine that sort of the detailed part of the report will be taking from your individual reports pretty much as is, with, just editorial kinds of changes. And the executive summary will come up with some sort of integrated piece. And again, the same thing with the conclusions and recommendations, an integrated set of those. Any comment on that? People think that's a good way forward? Subtle changes to that plan?
No, I think that the pieces we've been handed so far look wonderful, and stitching them together is going to be an artful endeavor, but I think the pieces look very, very good.
As I mentioned to a few folks before the meeting, my time is freed up quite a bit. A big project that I've been working on for the past few years has come to completion, so I've got a little breathing room before the next thing hits. And with the extension, we're hopefully going to get finalized by the City Council next week. It's the perfect time for me to dive into this, so I think that it's worked out rather well. So I'll plan on working with Todd and maybe recruiting one or two others of you to start that work, but I'll get that underway this month in anticipation that you'd get at least a draft of something next month and make sure we're going in the right direction. Any other business that we have? The next thing on the agenda, we do have time for public comment. Anyone back there? I can't even see Durrell through the chair today. You're hiding back there. I need to raise my chair up. Any comments from folks? And please do introduce yourself for the microphone.
Hello, I'm Darrell Cruz, live at 2007 South George Huff Drive, and I do want to commend the task force for the many hours of work that you are spending on this complicated topic. I also would hope that, and I understand the dynamic that people are really busy and people have lots of commitments, but it really would be nice for the public to be able to hear like a summary of how the groups are doing when you have your public meeting. And I know the necessity for having private meetings to get work done is good, but unfortunately the last couple meetings there's not been any reports and the group's been meeting, and so the public has no idea where anything is going with anything to comment on, probably until the final report is out. And I would see that as being unfortunate, because I was hoping, you know, each month there would be a summary of what you're doing so the public could respond and react, and that's not happening. And to give you an example of that, you know, Eric posted this and I read it, and I have a couple comments I would like to make in a report, but haven't had that ability to do with regards to anything else that's going on in between meetings. I'm going to try to make this somewhat clear if I can, because it's a real complicated subject. Last week I met with Anthony Cobb for about an hour and talked to him about a number of different issues with another individual. And one question I asked him is what he thought was driving the violence that's going on in the African American community in Champaign, because there's been 8 murders in the last 10 months. And I asked him a very simple question. I said, how much of this violence, of the crime that goes on, the troubles that are going on within that community, do you think are gang-related or drug-related? Types of either directly or indirectly in some form or fashion. And he wouldn't give an answer, but he said there's a significant of crime that goes on that is directly related to that aspect of drug dealings, drug sales, getting money, all of that type of thing. Historically, if you go back into the 1990s and you read a book, Black Dragon, that was basically written to uncover racial profiling on the New Jersey Turnpike, where the New Jersey Police Department stopped 95% of the cars they stopped were people of color, specifically for confiscating drugs that were going into New York City. And that was charged, and they were trained to do that. And they got lots of money, and they kept the assets that they got. And the New Jersey Police Department became the national model and training of how to interdict drugs throughout the country, okay, which has all been refuted, okay, because that was clear racial profiling. But why I say that, because that created a historical context in the 80s and 90s that still, I think, has some role to play in what's going on in policing when it comes to investigatory traffic stops. And I want to mention, it's when in your report you talk about calls for service and crime, okay? The thing that leaves me uncertain as to what we're talking about. Are we talking about crimes like burglary, that kind of characteristic of crimes people commit? Or are we seeing those types of crimes that are, especially in the African American communities, that are drug related? Okay, because historically you've seen that law enforcement generally, when you have hotspot policing, and you gave a lot of wonderful examples, like you can have a bar or a lounge and other situations. But the big issue a lot of times is there's a dealer in the neighborhood, or there's people pushing, or there's people using, or whatever. And the tendency has been, and I think it's been statistically shown, that the war on drugs has been fought primarily in the criminal justice system against people of color. And the investigatory traffic stop, the traffic stops you explained, and I've done a ride along, are very commendable in terms of how they're done. But you could stop a car, and you may not know who the driver is, but if it happens to be a young black male, for example, you might ask a question or two more beyond. That's pretty standard in many cases, especially if it's in a hot spot policing area. So the question comes back to, and I don't think, if you're trying to find out why these racial disparities exist, and you use the example in Iowa City of at one time, there are communities where there are no racial disparities, where there's significant populations of minority people, but in traffic stops it doesn't exist. Iowa City was an example of that until there was a crime wave, a violent crime wave that existed within a black community, and you quoted it, and they did some hotspot policing, and immediately after that, all of a sudden, the racial disparities in traffic stops moved apart, okay? Because they were hotspot policing in areas where crime was going on. And I assume, I don't know what the crime was, but I would guess it could possibly be, and very likely could be, maybe similar to what they're experiencing north of University in Champaign. Okay.
You're over your 5 minutes.
I know.
Go finish up.
Can
when
I
you-
finish? Okay.
We do have time.
I'm going to just a minute or more, two more, if
Thank
you
you.
could. Okay. And so what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to investigatory stops, and when it comes to the disparities involving people of color, in this community, it's basically African Americans, I think you need to get into a little deeper the issue of not just crime in general, but drug-related crime, in terms of asking, are we stopping because all I read in the paper in traffic stops, they also discover marijuana or heroin or contraband or whatever. There's a lot of those types of examples that are part of traffic stops, okay, that go in there. And I would suggest, I shared it with Andy, this book came out just a few months ago. It's called Chasing the Scream by John Hari. He's a reporter from the United Kingdom. He's come over to study the war on drugs. And if you want to ask yourself, why we have, in many cases, racial disparities in traffic stops, why we have racial disparities in the criminal justice system, why that's disproportionate, he will tell you it's because we police communities differently when it comes to the war on drugs, not because of other things, okay? We don't police racial groups the same when it comes to drugs. And he explains why, and there's statistical information that shows that's happening. And that could be, and he has suggestions, and you could look at Uruguay, Portugal, there's a lot of examples, Vancouver, Canada, that address these issues. And I would suggest that's a topic that, I think somehow needs to be incorporated into the report or the recommendation, because the fraternities or sororities or Southwest or Champaign is not being policed, because for whatever reasons, the same way is that. And that seems to be some aspect, at least to a certain degree, in these disparities that exist.
Thank you, Darrell. I think this segues very well off of the last part of your report, and I would suggest you communicate afterwards. Any questions for Darrell? Sorry, I forgot to ask.
Yeah, not a question. I'll just say that I completely agree with you on the issue of how the war on drugs impacts on this. And that's actually the book that I would recommend and that I cited. And I think the book that you've recommended is probably, is also very good. But Carl Hart's book, High Price, and the thing that attracted me to Hart's book is that he bridges the worlds. He's a neuroscientist who studies addiction, very reputable person in that respect. But when he was a teenager, he was dealing drugs in a black neighborhood in Miami, and he ascribes the fact that he was able to get out of there and achieve what he achieved because he never got caught. He never got arrested. He never got into the criminal justice system. And I'm totally, I'm in total agreement with you, Darrell. I think that's only going to be, I mean, I think it can be mentioned in our report, but it's not at the heart of our report. But I think it's something that should be taken up with, in the context of the general reform movement of the criminal justice system that's in the early days of emerging locally.
So, any questions? Thank you, Darrell.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, we've already done our staff report for the evening. Any announcements from folks? All right. Seeing none, then I believe we are adjourned, and hopefully next month we will drum up a quorum and get now a stack of minutes approved, and we'll have some draft report to work on. So, thank you all for coming down.